Welcome to RealAg Politics here on RealAgriculture.com. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Thanks so much for joining us here today for another great show. You know, we are having a great time breaking down some of the big ag policy issues that are happening in our country. And it is great to get the support and the audience and all the feedback that we've gotten from all of you out there across the country on some of the topics that we've talked about here in the first two episodes of this season. And I think we got another great one here for you today. So what we're going to talk about today is gene editing. We're going to hear from Krista Thomas. She's with Canada Grains Council. She's their VP of Seed Innovation and Trade Policy. We're in right now, the third consultation. So now they're looking at livestock feed as it applies to gene-edited crops, okay? This is the final stage. Now, Krista's going to be here, and she's going to talk about what this stage means. How likely is it that we don't have any sort of hiccups? And what does it mean for the international trade arena as well? We're also going to hear today from Tyler Mcann of CAPI. We're going to talk about some of the, well, not just the federal government, but the Conservatives and the NDP really focusing on food prices again. We heard some commentary from Minister Champagne, Minister of Industry, last week, making some promises that he had sat down with grocers and he was going to put them in line and food prices are going to go lower because the government's introducing food companies or grocers to competition. Believe me, they understand competition. It's a very competitive environment. I'm being a little cynical here when I hear some of the commentary coming out of the government. Tyler's going to talk about all of this from the ag perspective in the sense that, hey, agriculture seems to be being left out of this whole discussion. What do we make of this government promise that they have really, I guess, gone pedal down on in this case? We're also going to hear today from Ian Boxall, president of APAS. He farms in Tisdale, Saskatchewan. Ian is going to talk to us about there's some concern at APAS amongst their group and other farm groups in terms of the potential merger between Bunge and Viterra. Now, we've got some Real Agri Studies data, which is the market research arm of Real Agriculture, saying that, hey, APAS is not an island here. Farmers are concerned about this merger. They're concerned about poor basis. They're concerned about another less buyer to bid on their grain. That lack of competition does not speak well for the farmer. Ian's going to talk about why APAS is concerned and what should be done about this going forward with the Competition Bureau and the federal government and the province of Saskatchewan as well. Now, before we get to the lineup, if you have any feedback, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Of course, you can find Real Agriculture across all the different social media platforms. And if you really want to get it off your chest, you could type it out, right? You could send me that email, or you could call the RealAg feedback line. That number is 855-776-6147. Okay, let's get to it. Let's rock. This is RealAg Politics. This is episode number 3 for this season, and let's get to it. Let's talk about gene editing right now. And this is a topic, it feels like we have been in the process of trying to have this approved in Canada for quite some time. It has been a lengthy process, and we're in that final stages, and we're going to hear all about it right now from Krista Thomas. She is VP of Seed Innovation and Trade Policy with Canada Grains Council. Krista, great to chat with you.
Thanks for having me, Shaun.
Okay, we've launched and when I say we, I mean the Canadian government has launched the third and final consultation of this regulatory framework for gene editing in Canada. What is this consult on specifically, and give us some of the timelines?
Sure. So if you are a plant breeder and you develop a new variety in Canada, you potentially have to go through 3 different pre-market safety assessments. There's one at Health Canada on food safety. That piece was completed in 2021. And then there are 2 pieces at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, one on environmental safety, that was completed last year. And now we're in the final piece focusing on livestock, animal and livestock feed safety.
Now, when I hear livestock and feed safety, if we've passed the Health Canada human safety component, I would think this would be, I don't want to say a lower bar, but this is a hurdle I would not be that concerned about. Or am I getting way too far ahead of myself?
Well, it's really good to see that there is a high level of alignment between the different areas. I think that there are, when it comes to livestock feed, because it has to be clear for people who are formulating feeds what the composition of some of their ingredients are. And you've got animals who are eating the same diet for their entire lifespan. So the livestock feed division looks at things a little bit different from Health Canada, but in all three cases, the reviewers have acknowledged that gene editing does not add any additional safety risks or concerns beyond conventional breeding. And what really matters is how you're changing the product at the end of the day.
Okay, so how long does this consult go for? Mid-November?
I believe it closes November 27th.
Okay. Once it closes, then what happens? What does the process look like to get this across the finish line? Now, this is something I know Canada Grains Council and other organizations have been really pushing for this to happen. So what does the timeline look like post-consult?
Well, that will be up to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, but we're really eager to have this last piece in place. When we have these three pieces completed, it's going to provide clarity for plant breeders. They'll be able to know if the products they develop need pre-market regulation, pre-market safety assessment or not. And that's really important because without that clarity, it's difficult to get funding for research. It encourages investment, to maybe move outside of Canada to the US or other places where there is better clarity. And it means that we really can't start introducing these products in Canada. So farmers won't have access until these three pieces are in place. So our hope is that the livestock feed division can review the comments that it gets quickly and move on to the final publication of their guidance as soon as possible.
What is how encompassing, or what is the scope of livestock? Is like, of course, I think cattle and pork and sheep, chicken. How far out does this go?
Oh gosh, you'd have to check with the regulators on the exact definition, but it covers all of the well, from my perspective, from the Canada Grains Council, pretty much any crop we grow can end up in livestock feed. So this is an important piece because pretty much any new variety can end up in livestock feed. So we need to have that clarity about whether this regulatory approval is needed or not.
So who's providing feedback or participating in this kind of consult from a livestock feed safety perspective?
Well, the consultation is open to the public. So it's open to stakeholders across Canada, and the Canada Grains Council representing, we have a wide membership that includes the seed innovation sector, grain growers in Canada, all of the major field crop commodity associations and exporters. So we will be providing comments on the document as well from the perspective of our membership.
So let's just sort of fast forward here. Let's suppose that this is all given the green light. Gene editing at that point, after this third and final consultation, then gene editing would be allowed in Canada, and basically that would be the green light, or are there additional stages past this?
Well, it depends on how gene editing is being used and how the plant is being changed. So what the livestock feed consultation document and the two pieces that are finalized have said is that if you have a new plant variety and you introduce foreign DNA into that plant, so you've made a transgenic plant or a GMO, that type of plant always needs pre-market safety assessments. So you're always going to go and talk to the regulator before that plant can be sold as food or grown as a crop. When it comes to everything else, so conventional plant breeding and gene-edited plant varieties, the regulators have laid out types of end goals for the plant breeder, types of plant breeding outcomes that they think could pose a risk and would require an assessment. So for human food, that's things like, if you were ever to increase a toxin or an anti-nutrient, or If you were to make a change to the nutritional profile of a crop that is so big, you'd be bumping into a dietary upper or lower limit. That's something that always needs a pre-market assessment, whether it was gene edited or bred through conventional means. So we'll have that clarity. Under the system today, it's not always clear what types of breeding objectives or goals need to come in. So there's been a lot of confusion. We've had cases where plant breeders have approached the regulator to ask, are they regulated? Are they a novel plant? And they don't get an answer for months and months sometimes. So hopefully we're removing that problem and providing greater certainty for the researchers in Canada.
Yeah, I would think on this topic, the more clarity, the better. So people know what the path is for them to follow in order to pursue product development. If you can't get answers and there isn't clarity and maybe there's mixed messages as we try to work our way through the regulatory obstacles, that like to me that just speaks of slowing the whole process down. And when we talk about being competitive on the global stage, we want as much clarity as possible so people know what that path is. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, 100%, Shaun. And Canada, it's my personal opinion, but I think Canada is developing the best regulatory framework for gene editing in the world, because we're maintaining that product-based approach, but also bringing this clarity, and we're also bringing new transparency tools to the process as well. But when we look at what's happening in the world, many countries are ahead of us. Argentina was the first country to have clear guidance for gene editing back in 2015. Japan finished in 2018. Many countries around the world have either finalized their guidance or they're right along Canada in working through that now.
Yeah, my understanding is Canada at one time was kind of was sort of the leader in addressing this, and through whether it's feet dragging or just being slow, maybe it's there's been an election cycle, whatever excuse you want to use. My understanding is we're kind of playing some catch up here, but there's an opportunity for us to also come out with some of the leading guidelines in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Canada has always had a leadership role in regulating new plant varieties because we've always had a science-based, product-based approach. And we were really excited when the Health Canada guidance came out in 2021, if I'm remembering correctly. So it would have been nice to have had all three pieces completed around the same time, but we're just glad that we're getting there now.
Okay. What do you, Canada Grain Council's perspective, what do you see as the big benefits here once gene editing is fully allowed in the country and we can see some of those benefits? What can we expect?
Well, our members have kind of two goals for gene editing. So the first is we want to have a regulatory environment in Canada that enables innovation so that investment will come here, so that our plant breeders can develop more resilient seed varieties more efficiently and get those tools into the hands of our farmers. But at the same time, we also recognize market access is important as well. And that if our key markets, will not accept gene editing, that we won't be able to grow those products in Canada. So that's where the transparency piece really comes in, and making sure that we're going to be able to continue to deliver market choice as these products begin to enter into the field.
Well, here's where we're crossing into both your responsibility, seed innovation, but also trade policy. Mm-hmm. Is there any concern out there that if we are, for example, everyone picks on wheat, so let's just pick on that one for a second. If there was going to be gene-edited wheat varieties, do we have to worry that some markets, some key markets, will say, no, thank you, Canada? Is that a big worry for the industry?
It's been a very important part of our discussions going back a number of years now. So we could think, for example, about a food manufacturer in one of our markets, let's say Japan. That manufacturer might in the future want to buy grain that was not gene edited, or they might simply need to know which gene edited varieties they're buying, because they're going to have to make sure that that imported grain has met the Japan's regulatory requirements. So we need transparency through the system. And we've worked very closely with organizations like Seeds Canada and CropLife Canada to make sure we have the tools in place to have those discussions. So that means, no surprises, that there will be early consultation with the value chain before something is introduced. And if we're talking about a crop like wheat that doesn't have innovative varieties in cultivation, that lead time is going to need to be longer, most likely, to have those discussions. And it also means sort of full participation in Health Canada's transparency initiatives and industry-led transparency initiatives as well, so that farmers, when they buy seed, will be able to know if the variety they're purchasing was developed using gene. Farmers will have that information, and it can be passed through the value chain to end users and markets who are going to require it.
Great stuff. Well, Krista, appreciate it. There's still a lot of work to be done on this file. Indeed, I'm sure it's going to keep you and some of your colleagues there at Canada Grains Council very, very busy. This is just one of the consults that are currently underway that the government is doing right now that seem to all be overlapping here and have November timelines on them. So thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, up next here on RealAg Politics, we're going to talk about food prices and some of the things we've heard of the federal government as of late trying to be a part of the solution. Will that be effective, or is that just a whole bunch of political hot air? Joining us to chat about it is Tyler Mcann. He's Managing Director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, better known as CAPI. Tyler, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Shaun.
Okay, I know that you watched Minister Champagne the end of last week, heading into the Canadian Thanksgiving weekend, say the government was taking action. They had sat down with the major grocers and said, food prices are going lower. What was your thought, and is that even possible from the government's perspective to make that happen?
Well, I think we always get excited, Shaun, when the federal government's talking about agriculture and food. We often think that we don't get the attention that we deserve. But I have to tell you, it's a little bit disappointing that this is the attention that we've got, because if you look at food prices and you look at what's keeping food prices high, there's really not very much the federal government can do about it. And for the federal government to be out already claiming credit that them hauling CEOs to Ottawa is having an impact on food prices, it's really kind of hard pill to swallow to see this discussion, this discourse play out.
Yeah. What I found kind of peculiar was the fact that he referred to flyers that he had seen that morning, knowing that some of those flyers, those are planned 4 to 6 weeks in advance in many cases. So it's hard to believe that a conversation that happened on a Wednesday was going to show up in flyers on a Friday. But nonetheless, this topic of food prices, we've seen food prices start to, I think, according to data in Canada and in other parts of the world, we're starting to see it start to work its way down, no?
That's right. So the day after the CEOs were in Ottawa for their meeting, StatsCan came out with the August CPI data that showed that inflation had slowed to its slowest rate since February 2021. So again, hard to imagine that a meeting at the end of September was having an impact already in August. But the reality is these pressures that have been keeping food prices high were already working themselves out of the system, and food inflation was starting to slow. Again, this isn't just a Canadian experience. I think sometimes, again, we get caught up in the political atmosphere to think that Canada's special, Canada's different. Food inflation's been a problem all around the world, and all around the world, food prices are starting to settle down. There's nothing to do with the federal government in all of it.
And there's a difference, though, between food prices, like affordability, and we like a lot is being mashed together here. Regardless of how you feel about how the government is some of their policies in regards to what food prices are, we do have a lot of Canadians going hungry. And the rising food prices have really put a lot of food out of reach for them.
That's right, but it's not just rising food prices that are putting that food out of reach, and there really are these really significant growing concerns with food security. I think Food Banks Canada does a lot of really good, interesting work around the challenges that exist. And what their work points to and what their recommendations point to is that this isn't a food price problem, this is a poverty problem. And we've got too many Canadians that aren't making enough money to make ends meet at the end of the day. And it's not just the price of food that's making it hard to make ends meet. It's the price of housing, it's interest costs, it's the price of fuel, it's the fact that everything that people are purchasing is more expensive than it used to be, and that their wages typically aren't keeping up with it. And so the solution to that probably has a lot more to do with fixing the cost of housing, the cost of interest, not with necessarily fixing the price of food. But again, the federal government doesn't have many tools, or doesn't seem to be able to do much on the housing front, so they picked food instead.
What do you make of the fact that we had the House Ag Committee do their work in the springtime, looking into gouging by grocers? Came up pretty conclusive that it's not happening, yet all three political parties are still talking about grocers. Is this why did the committee even bother doing this work if we're not going to take anything that committee found to be fact, and the political narrative continues for all three major parties?
Yeah, I think the reality is, Shaun, that often the good work of parliamentary committees goes underappreciated and goes
Okay.
unnoticed. So that may be a bigger issue, but one of the things that they pointed to was that they didn't have enough data, and so they needed more information. And they pointed to a Competition Bureau report that was due out. So that Competition Bureau report has since come out, and what that Competition Bureau report says is that concentration in the grocery industry contributed to a modest yet meaningful amount. The reality is that grocery store profits have gotten higher, but they've gotten higher because input costs have gone up. And so if you have a 10% profit margin on something that costs $20, you're making $2 profit. But if you've got a 10% profit margin on something that costs $25, you're making $2.50. So your profit's gone up, but your profit margin stays the same. That seems to be what's playing out based on the evidence that we have. But that Competition Bureau report that everybody points to also acknowledged that they went out and talked to foreign retailers and said, why won't you come into Canada? If our market is so concentrated and there's such a need for competition, why? They thought, well, maybe foreign retailers are the solution. And what they point to is that the foreign retailers admit that the competition is tough in the Canadian marketplace, that they're not sure that they can come and compete on price inside Canada. And so I think again, it was just another piece in kind of that long chain of evidence that we've got that says that retail competition is not the issue that's keeping food prices high. There are issues with retail concentration, right? There are issues between our retailers and their suppliers, and there are issues where we would probably benefit from more competition, but we have to put this in perspective, and that perspective seems to be lost today on the federal government.
Is there a missed opportunity here for agriculture in this discussion? Like at the beginning, you said, hey, it's always a good thing when people are talking about agriculture, but it doesn't really seem in this discussion relative to what the government's trying to do that agriculture is really, really in the mix. For example, we had Minister Champagne talking about this, and this is in his area, but we don't hear much from Minister McCauley about this from a production agriculture standpoint. So missed opportunity, or am I missing some?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's important to remember that competition is in Minister Champagne's portfolio. But if you would have asked 2 months ago what minister was responsible for or had the lead on food prices in Canada, I would have said Minister McCauley. I would have said that the agriculture and food minister should be the lead on those types of issues. And Minister McCauley hasn't been at the table. I think that this is a huge missed opportunity. I do think this isn't an easy solution. I think that the example that I like to use is the supply chain task force that the government launched is a good way for governments to tackle complex issues like that. There was no single solution on the supply chain side. The government could have launched a food price task force, looked at it all along the food value chain, looked at what does it mean for production agriculture, where are there costs that can be taken out of the system without making anybody less profitable, because we do need profits. Profits are a good thing. We need people to want to be in the business, but the governments haven't done that. They forgot about the rest of the chain. So it's good that they're thinking about food, but they really should be thinking about the entire food system.
It seems that, like many topics, the nuance is sort of lost. Everything's in very short little sound clips that are great in Instagram reels. We've got the government saying, if you don't comply, we're going to tax you. And nothing says we're going to attract competition, like we're going to increase taxes. So there's that. We got the NDP saying that there is these hyperbolic profits that grocers are making. Just, the evidence is there in the earnings statements. And we got the conservatives saying that all of our problems will be solved if we just axe the carbon tax. And I'm not sure if any of that actually solves the problem. There may be short-term reaction to it from a price perspective, but long-term, I don't have the confidence that, hey, that's just going to be the ultimate fix. What are your thoughts from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I think, Shaun, in those three examples, and they're really good examples, there's a lot more smoke than there is fire, right? And it's unfortunate that again, I think the government is misleading with its focus on a windfall tax is going to fix things. If anything, they probably should be looking at taking taxes off of the system. And I don't mean the carbon tax, but there's been some good work done lately around the GST. Food is largely exempt from the GST, but we get into this world of shrinkflation where all of a sudden something gets caught now by the GST that wasn't caught before because it becomes a snack size. So maybe there's some relief there that governments could play. Again, the CEO space and the NDP, I don't know, Shaun, they've got their horse that they're whipping, but to me it's barking up the wrong tree. And the carbon tax, again, it would be good if Pierre Poilievre, every time he brought up the carbon tax, acknowledged that almost all on-farm fuel use is exempt from the carbon tax. There's a bill before Parliament to exempt all on-farm fuel use. Again, it has this compounding impact, and the impact of the carbon tax will get greater as the carbon tax goes up, but it is not the problem of food price inflation. If it was, you think that Canada would be worse than the rest of the world, but we're not, and we're actually better off than a lot of other countries when it comes to food inflation. So it would be good if all of them kind of threw out the rhetoric and maybe took a step back and thought about what they're actually talking about, but that may be too much to hope for in today's political world.
Okay, so the government comes to you and says, Tyler, what are the suggestions from CAPI in your perspective on what should happen here from a policy perspective? What would you tell them?
Yeah, so I think it is first admit that there's no easy solution, right? First, let's go back and say that what we need is long-term solutions. I would say that the good news is that the pressures that are keeping prices high are starting to ease. And so this problem is in part fixing itself. But if you want to find long-term solutions, what you need to do is take a systems-wide approach, look at where are there transaction costs that can be eliminated, where can we meaningful have an impact when it comes to competition, not just at the retail, but along the value chain. And I would say what we need to really do is understand that we're asking the food system to do a lot today, Shaun. Some of those things are making it more expensive. Making a more sustainable food system probably means a more expensive food system. Making a more resilient food system probably means a more expensive food system. And so we really need to understand that a lot of what we're doing is actually adding costs on, and we need to pick and choose. Do we want a food system that produces cheap, affordable food for Canadians, or do we want a food system that's sustainable and resilient? And we may not be able to have all of those things at once.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword. If you continue to increase the requirement and the regulatory burden on an industry, for example, that adds costs. And those costs get passed on. And so, yeah, I think you're right. We've been pretty used to cheap food for a very long time, and it's kind of uncomfortable when it's not.
And that shouldn't be a bad thing, right? I mean, that uncomfort, that reality means that we'll probably have a more profitable food system. Again, for the farmers that are across the country, profitability is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing for anyone. We just need the right checks and balance along the way. But that's not an easy solution. We need to stop pretending that there are easy solutions out there and look at this from a more meaningful perspective.
Hey, Tyler, really appreciate. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Shaun.
And we wrap up today's RealAg Politics by talking about a pretty important issue that I've been waiting for farm groups to dive into, and saw a release last week that really did perk my interest. And it's about the Viterra Bunge merger that is potential to happen on the Western Canadian prairies and will also impact farmers, of course, in the Northern Plains as well. Here to chat about one group's reaction to this potential merger, it is Ian Boxall. He is president of APAS and farms in Tisdale, Saskatchewan. Ian, great to chat with you.
Great, Shaun. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. I know you were delivering canola, I think, earlier today, so you probably had some time to think about this as you're at the elevator.
At Bunge, actually.
And you're at Bunge. There you go. Okay. So why did APAS dive into this one? What's the concerns?
I think the biggest concern is competition, right? We're seeing it in every aspect of the business, right? We're seeing it in dealerships. We're seeing it in farms input supplies. We're seeing it in auction houses. All of these amalgamations are giving farmers less option. And I think that it's just, this is one that is concerning. Bunge has some shares and some money in G3. Now they're going to potentially partner with Viterra, and they're going to have a pretty good hold on, Western Canadian grain buying. And it should be a concern for producers.
So from a policy perspective, like what is APAS asking for? Are you pleading with the Competition Bureau to stop it entirely, or is it for a deeper look at it? What's the ask?
I think it definitely needs looked at. So I think I think the Competition Bureau is looking at it. So we will be in contact with them about what that process looks like. We have also, the Saskatchewan farm groups and APAS last week, sent a letter to the Saskatchewan government to look at it. Saskatchewan is the most impacted, right? We grow the most grain. So we are going to be the most impacted. And I think there's a few things that we're asking the government to look at. We're asking them to look at, labor. What's going to happen? Maybe not the boots on the ground labor, but there's definitely going to be some management labor that could be lost here in Saskatchewan. We need them to look at where is there some overlap in the marketplace and where might competition be hindered due to this, and we want to make sure that they look at how this is going to affect port. How is this going to affect the ports, and what does the infrastructure these companies have at the ports look like? So we're just asking that this to have a bigger dive into what the effects will be on Saskatchewan and on the producers of Saskatchewan. So
RealAgri Studies had done some work on this, which is the research arm of RealAgriculture. I think it was back in the early part of the summer, and we asked producers, and I'll admit, I was kind of surprised on the strength of the opposition to this. But in your opinion, should the merger between Viterra and Bunge be allowed to proceed? 70% said no.
Right.
That's a pretty resounding number. So this isn't APAS kind of going sort of out on their own and you're on an island here. There's some, based on the farmers that we chatted with in our survey work at RealAgri Studies, there's a lot of farmers thinking this way.
And that's exactly it. So it's our members thinking this way. It's the members of the SAS Canola, SAS Wheat, SAS Barley, all of the groups that got together and put the release out, and they asked out last week to the Saskatchewan government. All of our members have the same thing. We're losing competition, and it doesn't bode well for farmers. At the end of the day, competition keeps the business fair and equitable, and we need to ensure that we have that.
Yeah, and Ian, I'll support with numbers. You mentioned less competition and some of the ramifications of that. What growers told RealAgri Studies in our survey is, okay, so you're concerned. Where is this concern? What areas are you concerned with? And two stood out. One, poor basis, and two, less options to market my grain. And depending where you are, that you're going to feel differently about that. But those are the two that really came out as the big reasons why people were concerned about this deal.
Oh, absolutely. So if Bunge has money in G3 and Bunge and Viterra merge, what are they is the basis going to be completely different from place to place when there's similar money and similar shareholders at every aspect of that? And I just look right here in Tisdale area, right? 2 Viterras in Tisdale, a Bunge in Nipawin, a G3 and a Viterra in Melfort, right? We're talking a pretty close-knit area that all of a sudden there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elevators with similar money, shareholder-wise, all tied up in the same conglomerate, right? So there's some concerns in some areas, and that's where the Competition Bureau needs to look. When the Louis Dreyfus and the P&H merger happened, they made those guys sell off some of those assets
Right.
where there wasn't competition. And maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe this is an opportunity for someone new to come in. Maybe Cirrus or somebody like that steps up and plays a bigger role in Western Canada than what they have in the past. And it needs looked at. We need to ensure that we have competition when we go to sell our grain.
Yeah, and to that point of, that's kind of what the Competition Bureau with their work does. Like, think about the Monsanto Bayer merger, right? That's how BSF ended up with Invigor as an example, right? That it was like, if this is going to be approved, there needs to be a shedding of some assets. So you bring up a really good point. And people in the grain industry have brought this up to me that, okay, farmers are concerned, that's a natural response, but the reality is, if you look at the bigger situation, there's not as much overlap as people say there is. And in the areas where there is overlap, those assets can be shed and somebody else can step up and buy them. So at the end of the day, this is all going to go through. But I think you bring up a good point. This does need to be looked at and not just sort of rubber stamped.
Absolutely. And when I mean shed, I mean sold off. We can't afford to have them closed.
Good point.
Right? Yeah. Shedding an asset isn't just closing it, because we've lost the competition too, right? So It's a matter of finding somebody that's willing to buy that asset to ensure that there's competition in that regional area, right? So, when we say shed, we got to make sure that people don't mistake that oh no, well, they can close it. No, it needs sold to somebody that would be their competition, right?
Have you had much response from the statement last week?
Not a great deal. Not yet. I think there's a lot to look at here, right? There's a lot of things to look at here. I know the Competition Bureau is looking at it. I know there's another agency federally that's looking at this as well. So I do think there are some stuff some irons in the fire, making sure that this all is done on the, in what's best for producers. And I think specifically in Saskatchewan, we have a lot bigger handle in it, just because the amount of rural elevators that would be affected, rural terminals that would be affected, but also the amount of grain that's sold here. So I think Saskatchewan, our government really needs to have a look at it.
Yeah, and I would imagine from a Saskatchewan standpoint, I think something that I've thought about this whole time is the jobs in Regina. Viterra is headquartered there. The argument to open up Regina to more flights with some of the challenges that Saskatchewan has had from an airport perspective, losing a head office would not be helpful in that quest. And so I would imagine the province is definitely looking at this with, they've been kind of quiet about it, but I imagine that there's some work happening behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And for sure there is. And we want that head office of one of the biggest grain buyers in Western Canada. We don't want that in the States where Bunge is, right? Like, we want that here. So we need to ensure that those jobs and that office stays here in Western Canada. I think that's important. That's as important as any of it, right? The only advantage I honestly see is maybe some streamlining of some stuff at the port. That might be an advantage. If they have overlapping infrastructure, like, that might be an advantage, but that is the only one that I can see where, maybe they roll one into one or two commodities. They're not having to roll all commodities through every terminal. Maybe that would help our freight system a little bit, but honestly, off the top of my head, that would be the only advantage that I would see to the merger.
Ian, do you think that some of the pushback on a merger like this happening is sort of speak to the overall concern that farmers have about consolidation in the value chain? And why I say that is, we asked farmers at Real Agri Studies, are you concerned about consolidation in the Canadian agricultural industry? 90% said yes. It's pretty strong. So is this sort of a situation where I may not even know all the details? I'm just concerned about consolidation, period. Is that at work here a little bit?
I think absolutely. I think as we see dealers, right, farm equipment dealers become, province-wide almost in some cases, right? You're limited on, you want a price on a John Deere combine, well, it's service, quite a ways, you got to go a long ways out of that to get somebody that isn't, owned by service. So I think consolidation on all those fronts, right? Auction houses, one or two left in the whole process that'll even auction off any of your farm equipment. You go to retire. I think everything's been consolidated, and I don't think the farmer has seen a benefit to them in any of that. So immediately our backs are up when we hear about it.
Okay, well, hey, appreciate you joining us. Keep us up to date on some of the feedback you hear, obviously federally or provincially, and we will chat again with you very, very soon. Are you done? Hey, by the way, are you done harvest?
I got 90 acres of sunflowers, a little trial I did here in Northeast Saskatchewan growing some sunflowers. So I'll be done next week.
Okay. Overall yields okay?
Yeah, I was happy. I think it just bodes to what, our research and development and our breeding does here in our grain to grow the crops that we grew here in Northeast Saskatchewan. What we had for rainfall really bodes well for our research and innovation on that front.
Okay. Well, Ian, thanks a lot for joining us here today. I really appreciate it, and all the best to you.
You betcha. Thanks, Shaun.
We were just hearing from Ian Boxall there from APAS. At the end of the day, I think this merger happens. I really don't see the Competition Bureau saying this can't happen. If you look at past deals that have transpired in the M&A activity, they always try to find a solution. Okay. And I just don't know. And everybody I talk to in the grain industry, I continue to hear the same thing. There is not as much global overlap as people are making this out to be. This is one where they will solve it, and they will sort out where there is the overlap, and this deal is going to proceed, and it does make sense. That's the grain industry's perspective when I talk to people that not only inside those companies, but people that work for some of the competition as well. So we'll see where this goes. I said on RealAg Radio a couple weeks ago, I was surprised that farm groups weren't getting involved in this because of what we saw in some of that Real Agri Studies data. If you want to find out more about some of that Real Agri Studies data, make sure you send me that email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Personally, I really hope that this gene editing consult goes well. This is something that Canada really needs to take a leadership position in, although it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this potentially impacts some of the trade relationships. Okay. Even in some of those conventional crops where we are using gene editing, is there any pushback? A lot of people talk about the EU. When I talked to Krista off air, she did mention there are signs the EU is starting to open up in some of these regards when it comes to things like gene editing. So that's another thing to follow. And I really appreciate some of the input there from Tyler Mcann. He's right. We're talking about food. It's great to hear people showing an interest in food because that does connect to agriculture. Remember, it's the Ministry of Agriculture and Agri-Food, right? But why are we not hearing more out of Minister McCauley? I'm looking forward to hopefully in the coming weeks to be able to interview Minister McCauley about his, 2.0 or his second time around the track when it comes to being the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. And that's definitely one of the things I want to hit on with him is, what is he saying in terms of food prices and what needs to happen from the primary industries perspective. Now, if you have any feedback on anything you heard today, we'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can, of course, also find us across all the different social media platforms, or I would love to hear from you about what you think about some of these ag policy issues. You can call the RealAg feedback line. That's right. It is 855-776-6147. Hey, thanks, everybody, for tuning in to RealAg Politics. We'll continue to bring these shows throughout the winter. Really appreciate your feedback, your viewership, and like and subscribe and put your comments in the comments below here on the YouTube channel. Appreciate everybody. Thanks so much for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Politics. See you again next week. Cheers, everybody.